#10 Rillington Place, the House of Horror. #full documentary script, 6,800 words, 48 minutes. The wallpaper in the kitchen at 10 Rillington Place had started to peel. Not unusual for a rundown flat in post-war London, where bomb damage and neglect had left entire neighborhoods crumbling into decay. But when the new tenant, Beresford Brown, decided to put up a shelf in March 1953, he noticed something odd about the way the paper bulged outward from the wall. He tapped it gently. Hollow. He tapped again, harder this time, and then he smelled it. That sickly sweet stench of death that once experienced is never forgotten. Brown grabbed the edge of the loose wallpaper and pulled. The paper came away easily, too easily, revealing not the brick or plaster he expected but a small alcove that had been papered over. He peered inside with his flashlight. At first, his mind couldn't process what he was seeing. It looked like a bundle of blankets, perhaps, or old clothes stuffed into the space for storage. Then he saw the back, a woman's bare back, pale and mottled with decomposition. Beresford Brown stumbled backward, his hands shaking as he dropped the flashlight. He ran from the flat, down the stairs, into the street, shouting for the police. Within an hour, 10 Rillington Place was swarming with officers and detectives. What they discovered in that modest ground-floor flat would shock even hardened investigators who had seen the worst of London's criminal underworld. Behind the kitchen wallpaper, they found not one body but three. 3 women, seated upright in the alcove, wrapped in blankets, their faces covered, arranged with grotesque care. The alcove had been their tomb, sealed away from the world by layers of wallpaper and the innocent domesticity of a kitchen. But that was just the beginning. As investigators searched the property more thoroughly, the horror multiplied. In the outdoor washhouse in the back garden, they found 2 more bodies. Beneath the floorboards of the front room, another. And in the garden itself, partially buried under overgrown weeds, 2 more sets of human remains. 8 bodies, 8 women, all hidden within the property at 10 Rillington Place, and the man who had lived there, who had murdered them, had vanished. The hunt for John, Reginald Halliday Christie, had begun. To understand the monster who created this charnel house, you have to go back to Yorkshire in 1899, to the birth of a boy who would become one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. John Christie was born in Halifax on April 8th, the 6th of 7 children in a strict, working-class family. His father was a carpet designer, a domineering man who ruled the household with an iron fist and frequent use of the belt. His mother was passive, overwhelmed by the demands of so many children and an authoritarian husband. Young John was a sickly child, hypochondriacal even in youth, constantly complaining of ailments both real and imagined. He was a poor student, unremarkable in every way except for his tendency toward petty cruelty and an unsettling habit of visiting the local mortuary to stare at corpses. His classmates remembered him as odd, withdrawn, someone who seemed to exist on the margins of normal childhood. But the event that would shape Christie's psychology occurred when he was 8 years old. His grandfather died and the family attended the viewing of the body. Young John was brought to the coffin to pay his respects. He stared down at his grandfather's waxy, lifeless face, and something shifted inside him. He felt no sadness, no grief. Instead, he felt a strange fascination, almost excitement. The absolute power of death, the transformation of a living, breathing person into a thing, an object to be viewed and handled. This concept took root in his developing mind. As Christie entered adolescence, his sexual development became twisted with this morbid fascination. He began associating sexual arousal with death and powerlessness. In his late teens, he had a brief relationship with a girl that ended in humiliation when he experienced impotence. The mockery from her and others who heard about his failure devastated him. From that point forward, Christie found that he could only achieve sexual satisfaction with women who were unconscious or dead, women who couldn't laugh at him, couldn't reject him, couldn't exert any power over him whatsoever. He married Ethel Waddington in 1920, a quiet, long-suffering woman who would remain with him through decades of dysfunction. Their marriage was largely sexless. Christie's impotence problems continued with conscious, willing partners. He worked a series of menial jobs, never able to hold a position for long due to his prickly personality and frequent illnesses. He had several minor criminal convictions in the 1920s and 1930s: assault, theft, and one charge of violence against a prostitute, for which he served 6 months in prison. During World War II, Christie served as a special constable with the War Reserve Police. It was a perfect role for a man with his psychology. He had a uniform, authority, and most importantly, access to people in vulnerable situations during the chaos of the Blitz. This was when Christie began to refine his methods, though no murders from this period were ever definitively proven. But he learned how to use his veneer of respectability, his position of minor authority, to gain trust and access. In 1938, John and Ethel Christie moved into the ground-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place in Notting Hill. The address sat in a shabby neighborhood of London, a place where poverty and desperation were commonplace. The building itself was a 3-story Victorian terrace house that had been subdivided into flats. The Christies occupied the ground floor, with access to a small back garden and an outdoor washhouse. Other tenants came and went in the flats above, transient souls looking for cheap accommodation in an expensive city. The street itself was narrow and dark, hemmed in by similar buildings on both sides. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where screams and arguments were common enough that neighbors had learned to ignore them. The perfect hunting ground for a predator. Christie's first confirmed murder occurred in August 1943, though he would later claim there were others before this. Her name was Ruth Fewest, a 21-year-old Austrian nurse who had fled Nazi-occupied Europe. She was working as a munitions factory worker when she met Christie, likely through his work as a special constable. He invited her to his flat while his wife was away visiting relatives in Yorkshire. What exactly Christie told Ruth to convince her to let him render her unconscious, we'll never know. But his method was consistent across his murders. He would convince his victims to inhale domestic gas from the supply line, telling them it would help with some ailment or another. Christie had rigged up a crude apparatus, a rubber tube connected to the gas pipe, which he could place near his victim's face while they sat in a deck chair he kept for this purpose. The gas would render them unconscious but not kill them immediately, and in those moments between consciousness and death, Christie would rape them. He could only perform sexually when his victims were in this state, passive, powerless, unable to respond or resist. After he achieved climax, he would strangle them to death, sometimes while they were still unconscious, sometimes as they began to wake and realize what was happening. He buried Ruth Fewest in the back garden at 10 Rillington Place in a grave he'd dug beforehand. He covered it with soil and planted vegetables on top. Death and domesticity intertwined. His second victim was Muriel Eady, a 31-year-old woman who worked at the same factory as Christie. In October 1944, she made the fatal mistake of mentioning to Christie that she suffered from catarrh, a respiratory condition. Christie, ever helpful, told her he had a special inhalation therapy that would cure her. He invited her and her boyfriend to his flat for tea. After tea, while the boyfriend waited in another room, Christie took Muriel to the washhouse where he'd set up his gas apparatus, telling her boyfriend she was receiving treatment. The boyfriend sat in the Christie's parlor drinking tea with Ethel, while just meters away, Christie was gassing, rapping, and strangling Muriel Eady. When enough time had passed, Christie emerged and calmly told the boyfriend that Muriel had left through the back way, feeling much better. The boyfriend believed him and went home, assuming his girlfriend would contact him later. She never did, because she was buried in the garden next to Ruth Fewest, another flower bed marking another grave. These murders might never have been discovered if not for a Welsh laborer named Timothy Evans, who moved into the top-floor flat of 10 Rillington Place in 1948 with his wife Beryl and infant daughter Geraldine. Evans was a simple man, borderline intellectually disabled, illiterate, and easily confused. He worked as a van driver and struggled to support his small family. His wife Beryl was 19 years old, overwhelmed by motherhood and the grinding poverty of their situation. By the autumn of 1949, Beryl was pregnant again. She didn't want another child. They could barely afford the one they had. She began making inquiries about abortion, which was illegal at the time. This is where the story becomes murky, contested, and ultimately tragic in ways that go beyond the murders themselves. According to Christie's later confession, Beryl approached him about performing an abortion. Christie, with his superficial medical knowledge from his police work and his ability to project authority, agreed to help. What happened next is subject to debate, but the end result was clear. On November 8, 1949, Beryl Evans died. Whether Christie intentionally killed her during a botched abortion or whether he deliberately murdered her for sexual gratification is unknown. What is certain is that after Beryl died, Christie raped her corpse. Timothy Evans came home to find his wife dead. Christie, with his calm authority and persuasive manner, convinced the panicking, confused Evans that this had been a tragic accident during a medical procedure. He told Evans that if he went to the police, they would both be arrested, Evans for conspiracy to commit illegal abortion and Christie for performing it. Christie said he would dispose of Beryl's body, and Evans should leave London, tell people his wife had left him, and start over somewhere else. But there was the problem of the baby, Geraldine. Christie told Evans he knew a couple in East London who would adopt her. Evans, desperate and confused, believed him. He left London for Wales, thinking his daughter was being cared for by adoptive parents. She wasn't. Christie had strangled the 13-month-old baby and hidden her body along with her mother's in the outdoor washhouse. 2 more victims added to his tally. In Wales, Evans couldn't live with the knowledge of what had happened. His simple mind couldn't process the lies Christie had told him or understand the danger he was in. On November 30, 1949, he walked into a police station in Merthyr Tydfil and made a statement that his wife had died during an illegal abortion and that he'd disposed of her body in a drain. The police returned to 10 Rillington Place and searched. They didn't find Beryl's body in the drain because she wasn't there, but they did find both Beryl and baby Geraldine in the washhouse. Timothy Evans was immediately arrested for double murder. Here is where the true horror of 10 Rillington Place transcends the murders themselves and becomes a story about justice failed. Evans was interrogated by police who were convinced of his guilt. His low intelligence, his inability to keep his story straight, his multiple contradictory confessions, all of this was used against him. At one point, Evans did accuse Christie of the murders, but when police questioned Christie, they found him credible. Why wouldn't they? Christie was a former special constable, a respectable working man with no criminal record that they knew about. His previous convictions had been under a slightly different name and weren't connected. He was articulate, calm, helpful. He gave evidence at Evans's trial, testifying that he'd heard arguments between Timothy and Beryl, that Evans had been violent, that he'd seen Evans carry a package that might have contained his wife's body. The jury believed Christie. They convicted Timothy Evans of murdering his infant daughter. He was only tried for that one murder, though clearly implicated in both. On March 9, 1950, Timothy Evans was hanged at Pentonville Prison. His last words were, "Christie done it." Nobody listened. John Christie had literally gotten away with murder, and he'd done it by sending an innocent man to the gallows. The police had been to his flat, had searched it, and had found nothing suspicious beyond the 2 bodies everyone already knew about. Christie's secret garden of corpses remained undiscovered. But Christie's compulsions didn't end with Evans's execution. If anything, that close call seems to have emboldened him. He'd faced police investigation and emerged not just unscathed but as a key prosecution witness. He was untouchable. In December 1952, Christie murdered his wife Ethel. She'd been with him for 32 years, suffering through his moods, his illnesses both real and imagined, his sexual dysfunction and his controlling nature. We don't know exactly what prompted him to finally kill her. Perhaps she'd found evidence of his crimes. Perhaps she'd simply become inconvenient. Christie strangled her while she slept, then hid her body beneath the floorboards in the front room. With Ethel dead, Christie was alone in the flat and his killing accelerated. In January 1953, he picked up a prostitute named Kathleen Maloney. He brought her back to 10 Rillington Place, gave her the gas treatment, raped her unconscious body, and strangled her. He placed her body in the alcove behind the kitchen. 2 months later, in March 1953, he murdered Rita Nelson, another prostitute. Same method: gas, rape, strangulation. Into the alcove she went. On March 6th, Christie claimed his final victim, Hectorina Mac Lennon, a 26-year-old woman who had been staying at 10 Rillington Place with her boyfriend. Christie murdered her while her boyfriend was out, then convinced the boyfriend that she'd left. The boyfriend believed him and moved out. Hectorina's body joined the others in the alcove. By this time, Christie was falling apart. The flat stank of decomposition. He'd stopped paying rent. Neighbors were complaining about the smell, which Christie claimed was blocked drains. He knew his time was running out, but he couldn't stop himself. The compulsion to kill had completely overtaken any sense of self-preservation. On March 20th, 1953, Christie sublet the flat to a couple despite having no legal right to do so, collected 3 months' rent in advance, and disappeared into London. He left behind his carefully constructed life and his tomb of victims. When Beresford Brown discovered the first 3 bodies just days later on March 24th, London erupted in horror. The newspapers ran screaming headlines about the House of Horror at 10 Rillington Place. As police searched the property and found body after body, the public's fascination turned to obsession. How could one man have murdered 8 people in a single building without anyone noticing? How had the police missed this when they'd searched the property during the Evans investigation? And most troubling of all, had they hanged an innocent man? The manhunt for Christie became one of the most intensive police operations in British history. His photograph was plastered across every newspaper. Citizens were urged to report any sightings. Christie, meanwhile, was homeless and wandering the streets of London. He'd shaved off his mustache in a pathetic attempt at disguise, but he was recognizable to anyone who'd seen his picture. On March 31st, 1953, a police constable spotted Christie on the embankment near Putney Bridge. Christie didn't run. He seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if the burden of his secrets had become too heavy to carry. He was arrested without resistance and taken to Notting Hill Police Station, just streets away from his former home. In custody, Christie confessed to all 8 murders. He spoke calmly, methodically, describing each killing in detail. He explained his gas apparatus, his sexual dysfunction, his need to have victims who were unconscious or dead. He showed no remorse, no emotion beyond a sort of clinical interest in describing his methods. Most significantly, he confessed to killing Beryl Evans. He claimed it had been during a botched abortion, that he hadn't intended to murder her but had done so accidentally, and then had strangled baby Geraldine because she wouldn't stop crying and he panicked. Whether this was the full truth or whether he'd murdered Beryl deliberately for sexual gratification, we'll never know. Christie was a liar who'd spent years perfecting the art of deception. But his confession meant that Timothy Evans, executed 3 years earlier, had likely been innocent at least of murdering his wife, if not his daughter. The realization sent shockwaves through the British justice system. An innocent man had been hanged based largely on the testimony of the actual killer. It was a miscarriage of justice that would ultimately lead to the abolition of the death penalty in Britain. Christie's trial began on June 22, 1953 at the Old Bailey. His defense attempted to argue insanity. Surely only a madman could commit such atrocities. But the prosecution painted a different picture. Christie was calculating, methodical, and fully aware of his actions. He'd hidden bodies carefully. He'd maintained a normal facade for years. He'd lied convincingly to police and in court. This wasn't insanity. This was evil. The jury agreed. After just 85 minutes of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty. Christie was sentenced to death by hanging. On July 15, 1953, at Pentonville Prison, the same prison where Timothy Evans had been executed, John Christie was hanged. He was 54 years old. His last words were reportedly a simple acknowledgement of his fate. He made no apologies, no final confessions, no expressions of remorse. But the story didn't end with Christie's death. The case of Timothy Evans haunted the British justice system for decades. A formal inquiry was launched in 1965 to examine whether Evans had been wrongfully executed. The inquiry concluded that Evans had probably not killed his wife but might have killed his daughter, though even this was questionable given Christie's proven willingness to murder children. In 1966, Timothy Evans was granted a posthumous pardon. It was a hollow victory. Evans had been dead for 16 years, hanged for crimes he likely didn't commit, his final words ignored by a system that had trusted a serial killer over a simple-minded laborer. The case became a cornerstone argument in the campaign to abolish capital punishment in Britain. If the system could execute an innocent man based on the testimony of the actual murderer, how many other wrongful executions had occurred? How many more might occur? The death penalty was suspended in 1965 and permanently abolished in 1969, with the Evans case cited repeatedly during the debates. 10 Rillington Place itself became a macabre tourist attraction after Christie's arrest. Crowds gathered outside, trying to peer into the windows, taking photographs, treating the site of 8 murders like a curiosity rather than a crime scene. The property was eventually demolished in the late 1960s as part of slum clearance, and the entire street was renamed. Rillington Place ceased to exist on maps, erased as if removing the name could somehow erase the horror that had occurred there. But you can't demolish memory. You can't rename evil out of existence. The case of John Christie remains one of the most disturbing in British criminal history, not just because of the murders themselves, but because of what they revealed about society's blind spots. Christie operated for years in plain sight because he understood how to project respectability. He knew that a man in a uniform, a man with authority, a man who spoke articulately and calmly, would be believed over a working-class laborer with limited intelligence. He exploited the class prejudices and assumptions of his era. The police believed Christie over Evans because Christie looked and sounded like someone they could trust. Evans looked and sounded like someone who could be a killer. The women Christie murdered were chosen specifically because they were vulnerable and because their deaths wouldn't cause much fuss. Prostitutes, refugees, women from the margins of society, people whose disappearances could be explained away or ignored. Christie understood that society assigned different values to different lives, and he targeted those whose lives were valued least. His method of using domestic gas was particularly chilling because it weaponized the ordinary. Every home had gas lines for heating and cooking. Christie turned this mundane household utility into a tool of murder. He convinced his victims that he was helping them, treating their ailments, offering them relief. They sat in his deck chair, breathed in the gas he told them would cure their coughs or headaches, and never woke up. The banality of the murder weapon, gas from the kitchen stove, made it all the more horrifying. The psychological profile of Christie reveals a man whose sexual pathology drove him to kill, but whose intelligence and social awareness allowed him to do so with relative impunity for years. He wasn't a disorganized killer who murdered in frenzies of rage. He was methodical, careful, and patient. He planned his murders, prepared his gas apparatus in advance, dug graves before he needed them. He understood that respectability was his best disguise and cultivated it carefully. But he was also deeply disturbed by his own impotence and sexual inadequacy. His murders were ultimately about power and control. the absolute power he had over unconscious or dead women who couldn't reject him, mock him, or exert any will of their own. In death, they became objects he could manipulate without fear of judgment or failure. His necrophilia wasn't just a bizarre fetish, it was the logical extension of his psychology. He could only relate to women as things, not as people. The discovery of the bodies at 10 Rillington Place forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. How many other John Christies were there, hiding behind masks of respectability? How many vulnerable people were dying at the hands of trusted figures while the world looked away? How reliable was the justice system if it could execute an innocent man while the actual killer testified against him? These questions have never been fully answered. Christie's case led to reforms, better police training, more rigorous investigation procedures, the end of capital punishment, but the fundamental issues remain. Predators still exploit positions of trust. Vulnerable people are still targeted because their deaths matter less. The justice system still makes mistakes. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Christie case is how close he came to never being caught. If he hadn't murdered his wife, if he hadn't subletting the flat illegally, if Beresford Brown hadn't decided to put up that shelf and pulled away that wallpaper, Christie might have continued killing for years. The 3 women in the alcove might have remained undiscovered until the building was demolished decades later, if ever. The bodies in the garden might have turned to dust and bone fragments, indistinguishable from ordinary soil. It was luck, not brilliant detective work, that exposed Christie. And that's a terrifying thought. How many other houses like 10 Rillington Place are there, with their secrets still sealed behind walls and buried in gardens? How many other killers have died without ever being caught, their victims never found, their crimes never solved? The Christie case also highlights the particular horror of the domestic killer, the predator who operates not in dark alleys or abandoned buildings but in ordinary homes, behind ordinary doors on ordinary streets. 10 Rillington Place wasn't an isolated mansion or a remote farmhouse. It was a flat in a crowded London neighborhood, with neighbors on all sides, people walking past every day. The murders happened in a kitchen, a washhouse, a garden where vegetables grew. The absolute ordinariness of the setting makes the crimes more disturbing, not less. After Christie's execution, psychologists and criminologists studied his case extensively, trying to understand what creates such a monster. Was it his domineering father and passive mother? Was it the humiliation of his sexual failures? Was it exposure to death at a young age that desensitized him? The truth is probably some combination of all these factors, plus elements of his personality and psychology that we still don't fully understand. What we do know is that Christie represents a particular type of serial killer, the organized, methodical predator who uses social skills and respectability as camouflage. He's in a different category from the disorganized, impulsive killers who murder in fits of rage or psychotic breaks. Christie planned, prepared, and executed his murders with cold calculation. He maintained a normal life while simultaneously being a serial killer and necrophile. He could sit in court and lie convincingly enough to send an innocent man to the gallows. This makes him in many ways more frightening than the stereotypical monster killer, because Christie looked normal, he seemed helpful, he projected trustworthiness, and that's what allowed him to lure 8 women to their deaths and nearly escape justice entirely. The bodies found at 10 Rillington Place represented lives cut short, potential unfulfilled, families destroyed. Ruth Fewest, who fled Nazi persecution only to be murdered in the country that was supposed to be her refuge. Muriel Eady, who just wanted relief from a cough. Beryl Evans, desperate to avoid another pregnancy she couldn't afford. Baby Geraldine, who never even had a chance at life. Ethel Christie, who spent 3 decades married to a monster. Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina Mac Lennon, women whose vulnerabilities were exploited by a predator. Each of them deserves to be remembered as more than just victims, more than just names on a list of Christie's crimes. They were people with hopes, fears, dreams, and loved ones who mourned them. The tragedy of 10 Rillington Place isn't just that 8 people were murdered, but that they were murdered by someone who saw them as disposable, as objects to be used and discarded. And Timothy Evans deserves to be remembered too, not as a murderer, but as a victim of a justice system that failed him catastrophically. He was intellectually disabled, easily confused, and railroaded into a conviction by police who were certain of his guilt and dismissive of his attempts to point them toward the real killer. His execution represents one of the worst miscarriages of justice in British legal history. The physical address of 10 Rillington Place no longer exists. The street was renamed Ruston Close, and the buildings were torn down and replaced with modern housing. You can visit the area today and find no indication that anything terrible ever happened there. But the memory persists. Books have been written, films made, documentaries produced. The case continues to fascinate and horrify new generations. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps we need to remember 10 Rillington Place, not as a ghoulish tourist attraction, but as a reminder of the evil that can hide behind ordinary facades, the vulnerabilities that predators exploit, and the failures of justice that can cost innocent lives. The house itself may be gone, but the lessons of what happened there remain as relevant today as they were in 1953. John Christie died on the gallows, but the questions his case raised have never been fully answered. How do we identify predators who are skilled at appearing normal? How do we protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them? How do we ensure justice is truly just, not just convenient? How do we prevent another Timothy Evans from being executed for crimes he didn't commit? These aren't just historical questions. They're urgent, contemporary issues that society still struggles with. Serial killers still operate, hiding their true natures behind masks of normalcy. Vulnerable people are still targeted and exploited. The justice system still makes mistakes, though hopefully none as egregious as executing an innocent man based on the testimony of the actual murderer. The house at 10 Rillington Place is gone, torn down and paved over. But its shadow remains, a dark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it lives next door, greets you politely in the hallway, and offers to help with your ailments. Sometimes it wears a uniform and testifies in court. Sometimes it gets away with murder for decades, hiding its victims behind wallpaper and beneath garden vegetables. And sometimes, through a combination of luck and one man's curiosity about putting up a shelf, the truth finally emerges. But by then, the damage has been done. The victims are dead. An innocent man has been executed, and all we're left with is the knowledge of what happened and the determination to ensure it never happens again. That's the true legacy of 10 Rillington Place. Not the sensational horror of 8 bodies found in one house, but the sober recognition of how easily evil can flourish when we trust appearances over evidence, when we value some lives less than others, and when we're too confident in our ability to distinguish guilt from innocence. The house is gone, but those lessons endure, as necessary and uncomfortable today as they were 70 years ago.